Good afternoon. Welcome to all of you who are watching online. Very happy to have you here. My name is Peter Chawla. I work in the Financing for Sustainable Development Office at the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. We're very pleased to have you here for this FFD Forum side event on keeping promises, delivering the SDGs through shared accountability. This is being brought to you by Unicef, the International Budget Partnership, and Global Affairs Canada. We're very pleased to have you here joining us to talk about this really important topic on accountability. It actually seems to be a theme for the day. For those of you who are at the FFD Forum this morning, there was a lot of discussion about on the tax side, how you ensure accountability. And I think now we'll talk about some of the spending side and how you deliver accountability as well, which is really welcome. As I said, I'm Peter. I'm the moderator for today. We have a great set of panelists to talk you through some of the research and experience that we have in the world now with trying to ensure accountability by having credible budgets. Before we get into the speakers, just a little bit of some rules of the road here. We have interpretation today for those of you who need interpretation services. So that's available at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. There should be a button that says something like interpretation or translation in the menu at the bottom. That's where it usually is. And you can select, I believe, English, French, or Spanish. So please, make the selection there so that you can make sure to hear the language of your choice at all times. Also, we want this session to be interactive. The aim is to have a discussion and to hear questions about the research and experience that we have presented today from a number of different partners. So there is two ways to have an interactive dialogue here. First, we have a chat function at the bottom of the screen as well. You'll find the chat function. We encourage participants to introduce themselves in the chat, talk about where they're from, briefly, and share any particular resources you want to share for other people who are listening. If you would like to ask a question, we'd like you to do that in the Q&A function, which is also in the bottom of the screen in your Zoom. You can join via the Q&A and ask a question, and then once we go through the presentations, when we have the panel discussion, we'll use those questions as the basis for the discussion for today. So I hope that's all clear. And then you can see on the screen the agenda. We have a couple introductory remarks from our co-sponsors. So I'm going to turn over first to Joanna Sahasmartin from Global Affairs Canada. She's the Director of the Natural Resources and Governance Division. She has quite a long experience at Global Affairs Canada, having worked for a number of years in Latin America, particularly on the Haiti program, and throughout the Caribbean. And so she'll give us the perspective of Global Affairs Canada to talk about why they view budget credibility as such an important issue. So Joanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm speaking to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people, also known as Ottawa, Canada's national capital. I'm very pleased to be here today, so thank you for the invitation. Canada is really proud to be co-sponsoring this event alongside the International Budget Partnership and Unicef. It's safe to say that the international community, we are all facing multiple crises right now, and these are threatening the decades of development gains that have been made by developing countries around the world. Compounding effects of climate change, COVID-19, unsustainable debt, food and energy crises, conflict are forcing developing countries to make very difficult policy decisions about where to invest their resources. These compounding challenges are reinforcing the essential nature of budget credibility and transparency in aligning scarce resources and investments to national sustainable development priorities and the delivery of social services, especially for women and girls and marginalized persons. Financing for development is a top priority for Canada and indeed for all of us here today. We've been very pleased to work alongside Jamaica and with the UN Secretary General to lead the Financing for Development in the Era of COVID-19 and Beyond initiative. There are a number of policy options that have been identified already throughout this process to help guide economic recovery efforts, including those focused on national planning, spending, and implementation. Specifically, one policy recommendation was that governments should translate plans into specific policies and investment plans and integrate it into national gender-sensitive budget and planning processes. This is in line with the SDGs and the Paris Agreement and keeps inclusion and gender at the heart of financing and recovery plans. Canada is strongly supportive of this policy position, and we continue to consider how we as a donor country and what we can do to support developing countries to move beyond budget planning to budget execution in order to move the needle on financing the SDGs. This requires sound public financial management, from budget planning to execution to evaluation, and is essential for development and poverty reduction. A sound public financial management system is a precondition to effectively channel resources, scarce resources, I might add, to service delivery like education and health services. The 2022 Financing for Sustainable Development report underscores that strengthening public financial management and budget execution can help maximize the effectiveness of government expenditure, including in the health sector and others. The COVID-19 pandemic has reaffirmed the need for greater and more secure public funding for health. However, while the return on investment in health and other social sectors is high, many countries were already experiencing severe financing constraints in these areas even before the pandemic began. When a government enacts a budget, there is an expectation by its citizens that the budget will function as a comprehensive roadmap, ultimately guiding funds toward effective delivery of public services and investing in sustainable development priorities. A credible budget, therefore, must be a priority. Achieving budget credibility and fiscal discipline should be prioritized in low and middle income countries and should anchor any efforts to address other objectives, including the strategic allocation of resources and efficient delivery of services. SDG Indicator 16.6.1, if you remember your indicators, reports that actual primary government expenditure as a share of the originally approved annual budget. This indicator is key to determining if the budgets of national governments are being implemented as approved. Deviating from budget plans is not necessarily intentional, with unexpected budgetary pressures often requiring unplanned expenditures. And this has been so true over the last 2 years. This is the inherent uncertainty of the budgeting process. On the flip side, deviations in national budget expenditures ultimately affect spending on key areas that have been targeted for social and economic development, such as any of the SDGs, and have a disproportionate negative impact on vulnerable and marginalized persons. A study co-sponsored by the International Budget Partnership in 2019 stated that overall, on average, national budgets are being underspent by almost 10%. The report shows that governments face serious obstacles in sticking to their plans during the execution phase, often affecting delivery of public services. The health sector, again, is a good example of this, where global estimates indicate that at least 1/5 of health spending is inefficient as a result of, among many things, insufficient resource allocation and inadequate tracking of resource expenditures. We as donors also have an important role to play to support budget credibility and to ensure providing our funding in a timely and predictable way. Canada does strive continually to improve the predictability of our aid, and we work with our partners closely to ensure sound public financial management and accountability of our investments. So today we'll be discussing what can be done to address budget credibility, challenges that affect progress across the SDGs. Without trying to preempt the discussions, but as previously mentioned, part of the answer is about moving beyond planning to execution and monitoring, including a focus on domestic resource mobilization. When people pay tax, and 2 of my sons are new taxpayers as of this year, they are empowered to hold their governments to account for how their money is spent. So I want to thank all of you for spending your time with us today, for sharing your knowledge and expertise, and I wish you a very productive session. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanna. That's very helpful. I especially appreciate the reference to the 2022 Financing for Sustainable Development report, which I helped work on. And thankfully, the next speaker we have coming up to introduce is Natalia Winda-Rossi, who's the Director of Social Policy and Social Protection at Unicef. Unicef is one of our partners in producing that Financing for Sustainable Development report. So Natalia, over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all. Warm welcome. Really also delighted to be co-sponsoring this side event with IDP, IBP and the Government of Canada. And of course, very excited to be able to have the opportunity to discuss such a timely issue, such as budget credibility. As we all know, and as highlighted my colleague Joanna, we are living in a very complex and uncertain times. The combined impacts of climate, conflict, and of course the pandemic has undermined the progress of SDGs, despite the very conscious efforts that many governments have been doing to protect children, families, particularly the most vulnerable. As you all know, for the first time in many years, we are seeing an increase in poverty and in child poverty, heightened by structural inequalities and also an exacerbated crisis of care. And you will be happy, Peter, that I will also talk about highlighting what the report on the Financing Sustainable Development report, which was really critical in highlighting some of the key financing gaps that we still have to achieve the SDGs, that they have further increased. Now we have even more wider challenges than before, and that it's really dependent that we need to focus on that and really help governments to really make sure that they have enough resources to particularly support social services. For UNICEF, this strikes directly to our mandate to safeguard the rights of all children everywhere. Government budgets are the main source of financing for social services and social investments. The decisions that governments make about how to fund social policies and services are critical to children's rights and ultimately, as we all know, to inclusive recovery and development. Given the profoundly unequal impact of the pandemic, both within and between countries, there's even a greater need to maximize the equity and impact of social investments. And UNICEF sees the challenge caused by poor budget credibility directly, as it impacts the delivery of social services and of course, our capacity to really help to further children's rights and impacts across different social sectors. We work very closely with partner governments and other agencies at national and international level to really ensure that child-related policy commitments are reflected in all stages of the budget process, strategic planning, budget allocation, budget implementation, and of course, execution. Investments in children, such as early childhood development, social protection, education, we all know are one of the best investments government can make. But we also know, and as highlighted before, that we need to go beyond plans, policies, and legitimate commitments if we really want to achieve real results and impact. And furthermore, translating those commitments into budget programs is not even the final step. We need to also be able to execute those budgets in a predictable way. Resources must be delivered in a timely and transparent way to the point of service delivery so that governments can deliver really on their commitment to their population and ultimately enhance their social contract. We acknowledge that there are many potential causes for budgets not to be implemented as planned, but we also know that it goes beyond a purely administrative issue. The potential social impact is significant. Teacher salaries may not be paid, disrupting education and livelihoods. Vaccines and medications may not reach clinics, risking lives, or social protection grants may be delayed, increasing the burden and risk for the most vulnerable. After the last few years, we know that also plans can change and unpredictable risk can make even more difficult to follow a plan. And therefore, it's even more important to continue to monitor and have very clear reporting on how budgets were implemented, including explaining any potential changes that were needed alongside. And it's a sign of transparency and accountability, which is, of course, is essential to build and maintain trust and confidence in governments. But it's also helped to make future budgets much more realistic, to ensure the future plans reflect the reality of what has happened to date. Government budgets are under increasing pressure with failing revenue and increasing demands. Public spending on social services have been reduced in many countries, and progress towards achieving SDGs has been, of course, disrupted. And it is even more important to ensure that all available funds are implementing as needed, as intended. And to this end, I think in Unicef, particularly around our work in public finance, we're really actively working with our partnering, including our government partners, development partners, CSOs, and communities to, one, build a very strong evidence case to prioritize and protect essential social investment within the budget, investment for children, that should be the lasting line for budget cuts, ensures that plans and programs are practical, cost-effective, and equitable, and also to strengthen the capacity of systems to effectively monitor, manage, and report on funding flows and implementation. And this includes some of the important areas of public financial management that Joanna mentioned, as well as improving transparency and accountability of results. In particular, Unicef is working to support governments to strengthen the management of budgets and fund, including at subnational level, whereas, as we know, is where most of the resources on social sectors are expended. And I'm really delighted that we're seeing increasingly more attention to budget credibility. UNICEF is a member of the Interagency Task Force on Financing for Development, where we're also very happy to see budget execution and strong public financial management highlighted in the report as essential areas to be considered to really understand and address budget credibility. UNICEF have been working very closely with IBP on this important issue for many years, and this includes partnering in several countries to unpack the causes and impact of budget credibility on key services such as health, immunization, social protection, which we hope will help identify practical ways in which countries and partners can respond to this challenge. And really, this event is an opportunity to advance this discussion. I'm really looking forward to hearing from the latest research insights, as well as perspectives and practical suggestions of how others have addressed these issues. And really, all organizations with an interest in government's budgets have a potential role to play in strengthening credibility. And we are fortunate to have speakers joining us from the Ministry of Finance in Ghana, civil society organizations, which are really engaging in this issue, showing the broad range of actors and stakeholders that have a commitment and a critical role in this area, as well as, of course, resource partners and technical partners. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion that follows and hearing of some of the questions and perspectives for those that have joined us today. Many thanks. Over to you, Peter.
Thank you, Natalia. That's very helpful framing for our discussion today. Particularly, I'm reflecting that the Financing Sustainable Development report talked about the social spending decline across a lot of sectors that we saw over the last few years since the COVID pandemic, and what the potential real negative implications are. But not just on the direct result in terms of increased poverty or hunger, but also worsening of the social contract, which you talked about, which is really important. That as we're increasingly asking citizens to pay taxes, they need to be receiving effective and services in return, and that's part of strengthening that social contract, which our Secretary General has talked about so much over the last year. Thank you again, Natalia. We're going to move now, slightly transition into some more detailed discussion. So our last actually co-sponsor of the event is actually going to move us straight into this discussion around research and findings from the field. So we're happy to have Sally Torbert here from the International Budget Partnership. She's the Senior Program Officer there. And has previously worked on the Open Budget Survey and is as a program officer there, as well as previously working with the World Bank and a number of UN institutions. So she has quite a wide variety of experience in the field. So Sally, please take it away. Give us some of the findings you're finding from, I think you've done some recent research in a number of countries about implementation and budget credibility, that indicator that was referred earlier from Joanna, the 16.6.1. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Peter. And a very, very huge thank you to Unicef and Global Affairs Canada for your collaboration in organizing this side event at the Financing for Development Forum. So the International Budget Partnership is working with civil society organizations around the world to promote greater transparency, public engagement, and accountability in government budgets, and to ensure that public resources are being used to advance equity and inclusion. And through our work, we've discovered that budget credibility is a challenge for many countries, and it does not get as much public attention as we think it should. So budget credibility, where governments fail to meet their revenue and expenditure targets in their annual budget, impacts whether the priorities that the government says it will fund, such as towards the Sustainable Development Goals or SDGs and national development goals, they actually are receiving those resources. And when we look at the data, we see that governments have chronic underspending and overspending issues. And when we see that, that is often a warning indicator for something malfunctioning within the public financial management system, which could be preventing funds from being channeled and used for the services that people need. So as Natalia was just saying, especially in these times when countries are facing such intense trade-offs, we've got supply chain challenges because of COVID and the Russian war against Ukraine. We've got higher debt levels that can limit space for additional spending. So right now, countries really do have to make the best use of available resources. And more importantly, those countries that do, in the long term, governments that show that they can spend their budget as planned, they build trust to show that they can deliver on their promises to their citizens. So next slide, please, Claire. So our research and engagement with civil society partners has shown that many government budgets are not credible at the moment, and particularly on spending on programs and sectors related to the SDGs. And so, we've had all of the recent reports, a lot of the discussions in this event where we're, talking about the SDGs not being on track to be achieved. We've got investments are lagging behind where we hope they would be. But even beyond those planned investments, as our speakers have just highlighted, these priorities can be shortchanged during budget implementation. So IDP has done some research a couple of years back looking at 35 countries, and it shows that government underspending, specifically underspending on budgets, tends to disproportionately impact low-income countries by an average of 14% below approved budget levels, as well as really in social sectors on which the poorest rely the most. So for example, we see the worst impacts found in health and agricultural sectors in those countries, as well as on capital spending. So next slide, please. So we are now working on additional new research that should be coming out soon that we've done within our team and within partners in 14 countries. And what we're doing, as Natalia said, is looking at the SDG 16.6.1, so budget deviations at the central government level. But we focused on spending in 7 sectors that relate to 10 SDGs. And in this analysis, by digging into how did the sector spending look different from the overall budget, we see that budgets for certain social sectors tend to be underspent in a greater degree than the overall budget. And so what you see in this slide here with the gray bars, you see that's the aggregate, that's the deviation you see in the aggregate budget, but in the colored dots, you see deviations within the sectors. And so even within countries such as Mexico or Ghana, where you see that the aggregate budget doesn't look like it's being underspent or overspent by a very large margin, certain sectors actually are being shortchanged during implementation. And so we'll be speaking, for example, later about agriculture spending in Ghana, but another example that I'll flag is in Mexico, where they actually have, we were looking at data for 2018 to 2020. We saw slight overspending on the budget on average in those years, but for example, spending in the environment sector was 6% below the approved budget. And then even the SDGs related to that, SDG 14 and 15, you see stagnating and decreasing trends. Now, this doesn't hold forever. We see a lot of different patterns, but it does point to the fact that this is worth looking into. Because we also covered 2020, we also could look at what changed in 2020 because of COVID. And we found that government budgets did shift as a result of COVID. That didn't necessarily worsen budget credibility patterns, as many governments were very proactive about adjusting their approved expenditures. But many countries shifted funding away from sectors that are necessary to achieve the SDGs, such as in education and in some cases, gender spending. One other finding from this research is that there's data gaps, and these data gaps can lead to accountability challenges. And so consistent, detailed reporting of spending is not yet made publicly available in all countries, and researchers have challenges tracking these sorts of trends. And so a lot of these estimates are relying on broad categories of expenditures such as ministry. That's not necessarily spending that's going towards the SDGs, it just estimates it. SDG budgets or mapping of expenditures to the SDG is not available in most countries yet. And even countries that do have SDG budgets are not yet reporting on budget execution according to those categories. So this tells us that we need to pull back the curtain and look beyond aggregate spending figures to see how underspending in certain sectors is holding back progress on the global goals. And the importance of effective implementation of government budgets, it is recognized within this indicator 16.6.1. But 16.6.1, which is looking at these deviations in central government budgets, it does not yet show deviations by sectors, which is critical to understanding how these deviations might impact our ability to achieve those specific SDGs. And because of this research, we also see that each country is different in terms of which sectors are the most impacted by budget credibility challenges, which means that this is an issue that must be examined and discussed in each country to understand why some sectors are being disproportionately impacted and how budget credibility challenges can impact performance and progress on the SDGs. Next slide, please. So what do we do about this? And so IBP, as Unicef, as Natalie just said, IBP along with our partner in Unicef, we are doing some deeper analysis in a certain set of countries to focus on trying to identify the causes of budget credibility challenges and do some advocacy to see if we can improve it. And working with our civil society partners, we've already seen some results. For example, in Indonesia, where our program has helped cut some red tape that's been resulting in underspending on subsidies for fisher folk that was really supposed to boost their livelihoods. And also is trying to focus on addressing bottlenecks in Nigeria on healthcare spending, which is boosting investments that improve maternal healthcare. And we hope that others can join us in this effort. And so we'd like to encourage those listening today to think about what you can do. And we have a few suggestions, and that would be think about how countries can prioritize improved spending on SDG programs by removing bottlenecks in the public financial management systems. And so governments really should be focusing on us identifying those bottlenecks, but they can also get technical assistance from development partners and donors. To understand these problems, we also need improved reporting and improved data, and that includes reports that explain why these deviations occur. So governments should be including in their government reports clear explanations when budget deviations occur. Sometimes they're justified, sometimes you can explain this, sometimes it indicates a problem. Governments can be open about that. And CSOs can make use of this data to really understand what's going on when there's underspending and under delivery in sectors to push for better results. In terms of the voluntary national reviews, this is a key place where looking at the data on 16.6.1, this can go deeper. This can start looking at sectoral trends. There can be greater analysis, deeper analysis, and the UN can encourage better and more detailed reporting by governments. And then supreme audit institutions also have a role in this. Many FAIs are now auditing SDG programs, and this can include looking at budget credibility issues. And Intosai has a role in encouraging members to take on these roles. So thank you so much. I look forward to the rest of the discussion. And Peter, back over to you.
Thank you so much, Sally. That was a really interesting dive into some of the research we've had already to look at where things at. And I think it's really striking the findings you had on chronic overspending and underspending and how that's related to SDGs particularly, but also the data gaps, which is something that makes it very hard to assess where we're at and where we should be going in terms of removing some of those bottlenecks that you talked about. Thank you again, Sally. That was very helpful. We're going to turn now to Mr. Moritz Piatti, a senior economist at the World Bank. But before we do, just because a few participants joined late, I just want to flag again, interpretation services are available, French and Spanish, as well as English, at the bottom of the screen. Feel free to go in there and select your appropriate language. We have a chat function where you can share with each other your names and affiliations, etc. But if you have questions for the speakers as they talk, it's great if you can pop those into the Q&A function. And then that's also available at the bottom of your screen. And then during the discussion, we'll have those questions for the panelists as we go through. So now we have Mr. Moritz Piatti. He's a senior economist at the World Bank, working on public financial management and health. He's focusing in reforms on the Africa region, and particularly on how technology might work on to solve some of our problems. And prior to joining the World Bank, he worked actually as an advisor in the Ministry of Health in Tanzania. So Moritz, it's over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Peter, and thank you so much to the organizers for putting this event together and getting such a rich group of discussants also together. So budget execution is, as the previous presenters already showcased, clearly a critical issue and probably never been more relevant than it has today, given all of the fiscal issues that are happening, right? So we want to ensure that we get good value for money. And we also want to ensure that in this increasingly constrained environment, that resources that have been allocated are also executed according to the plan as needed. But before I move on to the next slide, I would like to briefly talk about definitions, right? Because a lot of times we use budget execution and budget execution rates as interchangeable. And I would like to stress that there is a difference between budget execution rates, much of the data Sally has presented very well earlier, and budget execution practices. And with practices, I refer to how the budget has been executed, and what are the rules and processes in place that govern how we spend money. And that becomes particularly important in sectors because it guides what it is that sectors can do, it guides the protocols, it guides accountability questions and so forth. And so in that sense, I think it is particularly important to differentiate these two things, even though they are clearly related, because both of them will matter for service delivery. Okay, let's go on to the next slide, please. So what data is available on budget execution rates? What is it, and like what do the data show, and why does it matter for health sector service delivery? And my emphasis, given that I work in the health sector, will be on that. Next slide, please. From looking at PIFA annex data and BOOST data, these PIFA public expenditure and financial accountability assessments that get done across the world, and have annex data on budget execution rates. And BOOST is a tool that's available at the World Bank that looks at that assembles data from financial management information systems on on what the budget looks like in a very granular way, how the budget has been spent. We see that in the health sector, there is a clear differentiation across how different economic categories are being implemented, right? How they're being executed. So while wages tend to be executed in full, that is less so the case for goods and services, and even less so for capital spending. Right? And this also emphasizes the point that Sally has made before, that we really need to look in a granular way of budget execution rates. And it also shows that, right, so just looking at aggregate budget execution rates is not always helpful. And it shows that by breaking this down, this gives some information on the production function in the sector. Right, so if wages are executed in full, right, so health worker salaries are being paid essentially, but goods and services are not being made available, or capital spending lags, that is likely going to mean that the health workers don't have the necessary goods and supplies to work with to deliver services efficiently. Or it may also mean that the capital that is required for the delivery of services is not available. But and since the delivery of services is a function of all three of these, that if some of these budgets aren't executed in full, it can mean that there are real efficiency concerns. There may also be an over-execution of some items, right? So we have seen in some countries, such as Zambia, for example, we've also seen some of this in Ghana, that the wage bill has been over-executed, right? That political decision is made to increase salaries, and if that then is not has not been budgeted for, it will have to crowd out spending on other items, and again, it will lead to efficiency concerns. Now, the chart on the right-hand side, I would like to draw your attention to because it shows something about prioritization in the sector across government as a whole. You'll see two dots here. You see the green and the purple. The green across a number of countries is the share of the budget in the health sector as a proportion of the total budget in government. I apologize. The purple is the budget as a proportion of the total budget, and the green is spending as a share of total government spending. And what we see here is that in the health sector, there is systematic deprioritization of health in the budget. Right? So other sectors are getting implemented at a higher rate than the health sector. Now, many countries, lower middle income countries, have committed to spending at least 15% of their budget on health. But what we see here is that many of these countries have budgeted between 5 and 8% of the budget on health, but they're spending, right, which is already well below the Abuja target. But they're spending even considerably less so, like from 1 to 2 percentage points. And 1 to 2 percentage points is a lot. Right? Especially if we reflect back on the previous chart where we see that most of the budget has been spent, that the wage budget is implemented in full. And since the wage budget tends to make up a large share of the total budget in the health sector, it means that something else has to give. And that very often is the goods and services and capital budget. And it is, and those are the items that will matter significantly at point of service delivery. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So what is it that can be done? And Sally has already given some suggestions here. And what I would like to speak to are not concrete examples, because concrete examples will be highly contextualized, but I would like to talk about the process. Next slide, please. So, right, first of all, right, it is important to think through what the issues truly are. Right? How does budget execution rate affect service delivery? Right? What is it that we're actually concerned with? Right? And can we pinpoint these issues explicitly to specific institutions in government? Right? So in the health sector alone, there are very often different agencies. Right? There's the Ministry of Health, there may be an insurance agency involved. There's often a Ministry of Local Government. There will be a Ministry of Finance. And the question is, what is the issue? How does the issue affect service delivery? And who are the stakeholders? Right? And once we identify what these issues are, we can think about what are the necessary data requirements to consistently monitor and track issues on how they are developing, and then relate this clearly to the stakeholders, to the agencies involved. There are some budget execution issues in the health sector that can be related to a Ministry of Health. For example, there may be absorption capacity issues. There may be all sorts of other issues that where health is potentially at fault. But it may also be a different issue where, for example, the Ministry of Finance does not release the budget in full, and if the Ministry of Finance does not release the budget in full, working on health sector issues is not going to fix the problem. Right? So it is particularly important to see to clearly identify the problem and then relate the problem to the agencies involved. And then lastly, what I would like to point out is that we work in many different countries, in many different settings. Context, as always, is important. And then we need to think about the relationship, the interrelationship of some of these agencies. So who are the service providers, for example, and who are the budget holders, and how do these relate to one another? But the other question is, in a fiscally decentralized context, what does budget execution actually mean? Right? So the issues that are likely to come up in a country such as Nigeria or Kenya or Pakistan are likely to be a lot different from what one may find in a country, in a centralized country such as Rwanda. And then again, what that means from a problem-solving perspective is that the role of the agencies vis-a-vis how the budget is formulated, how the budget is implemented, and how that then trickles down to service delivery functions is going to be significantly different. And lastly, I would also like to point to countries in fragile settings and conflict-affected countries. And so taking, for example, countries such as Somalia, budget execution issues are likely going to matter significantly, as they do in other countries. But in a country such as Somalia, a lot of services are driven by NGOs and the capacity of NGOs to deliver. So what are we then looking at? Right? Because the type of questions, the type of problems are going to be significantly different. Right? So it's not that there is a one-fits-all solution or tailor-made solutions, but that one needs to think through in a fragile context, in a fragile setting. For example, the contracting arrangement between a Ministry of Health and those various NGOs. With that, let me thank you again, Peter, and back over to you, Chair. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Moritz Piatti from the World Bank, to give us that overview of health, where we saw the systematic underspend in health across many countries. I found that very interesting, particularly in the context where we're in, where we have so many health difficulties from the pandemic. We're going to move on now to a very specific country case to kind of dive deeper down into some of the issues. As Mr. Piatti said, you have to look at the specifics to really understand why there's underspend and what impacts that has. So we're going to turn first to Dr. Osei Oteng Asante. So Mr. Osei is a principal economic analysis at the Ministry of Finance of the government of Ghana. And I think Ghana is a very interesting case to have today because it intersects with a lot of the financing issues we're discussing in terms of in the overall agenda of the FFD right now, including debt sustainability issues, domestic revenue mobilization challenges, and many others. So I hope Dr. Osei will give us a great insight into how things are working in the Ministry of Finance in Ghana when it comes to executing the budget. Dr. Osei, over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter, and thank you everyone for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. So we just go straight in. This discussion will basically try to bring to light really some of the constraints that underpin what we consider to be budget credibility, and then what as a country we are doing to try and resolve that. So next, please. As I said, our presentation will simply talk about the introduction, give a nature of the issue we are confronted with and what we are doing about it. So next, please. Thank you. PEFE's assessment for budget execution for Ghana as of 2018 scores as D+, mainly because government is unable to deliver a predictable and timely release of funds to MDAs during the year. This negatively affects service delivery, planning and execution due to the constraints arising from cash flow issues. The main constraints for many of those, for many participants on this call, this constraint, the many complaints you hear from MDAs are that they don't get their budget released as usually announced. And it's something that is driven by many issues. So in this slide, we try to give you context to the fact that the deviations in the budget as usually occurs is related broadly to the issue of mobilization capacity. Currently, out of the 18 million potential taxpayers, about 8% only pay direct taxes. Overall, we have about 14% tax to GDP ratio. This compares less favorably to our peers on the continent who range between 18 and 20 as of now. That limited mobilization of revenue affects how we are able as a country to deliver on the planned projected resources to deliver to MDAs. There's a certain level of rigidities in the current budget system. About 75% of the budget expenditure is currently encumbered. From the word go, you barely have no control over 75% of the budget you announce. Compensation amounts to 27%, interest rate payments, 32%. Earmark funds and statutory funds, about 16%. Together is like 75%. I wish to highlight that in terms of compensations, interestingly, you find that it's dominated by health and education sector. Interest payments are for the loans that we have contracted over the period. Again, statutory funds mostly favor health and education because there's a GET fund, and then there's a NHIL fund, all of that. The law requires that under earmark funds, you have to pay this out of tax revenue. Immediately you get it. A certain percentage is given out. You cannot negotiate much when budgets are announced after compensation, so then you give them out. Together, if you put compensation, interest rate, and statutory funds together, it means that even the tax collected nationally is not able to meet that. It constitutes about 142% of tax revenue this particular year. The lower performance of revenue and the existing rigidities in the budget gives you very limited discretionary space to operate within. And this has within it competing needs. First and foremost, we are having to deal with issues with security, plus all the other social sector, economic sector issues that confront us as a nation. And the 25% remaining of that budget should be able to, is expected to deal with these challenges. Again, we draw attention to the fact that there are several recurrent emergencies that occur in our part of the world. I mean, rains are about to, we're in the rainy season now. You are likely to find flood here and there. The problem is now we are now fully aware that there will be flood. What we don't control now because of climate and probably climate change is the degree of devastation that occurs. So you are very limited in trying to plan the quantum of the size of the budget for emergencies. There are intermittent outbreak of diseases. And then we are just on the south of the Sahara and of the Sahel. I'm sure most people on this call are aware of the ongoing extremists in the Sahel region. Is drawing southwards gradually. Then it means that we are spending much more on security to be able to contain the spread of this extremism to this part of the world. Again, there are intermittent global pressures, economic pressures that come up. We woke up in end of February and found that there will be good food shortages, largely because there will be some disruptions in Eastern Europe. All of that imposed to us inflation and all of that, and it takes off some of the resources that we have originally programmed for key SDG related programs. And there are structural operational challenges. I mean, some of the instances we have to deal with are to the fact that some MDAs largely delay in even accessing the funds. Some will will clarify themselves as approval processes. Some will clarify as the network itself being down because we use an FMS system. All kinds of excuses are given in there for reasons why MDAs, even when there are some level of allocations and resources available, are unable to access them. And all of that contribute together to bring up a certain deviation in execution rate, which we are minded to address as we go along. Next, please. So what are we doing about these structural problems and these operational problems? Our first approach is to try and sustain the recovery of the economy following the devastating impact of the COVID pandemic on the economy. During the COVID period, the government of Ghana, in the middle of the COVID period, we wrote up a program to try and revitalize the economy for post-COVID. It's called the Ghana Cares Program. The ethos is to try and revitalize industry and businesses to be able to come back to pre-pandemic and exceed pre-pandemic levels, and therefore drive economic advancement. Our expectation is that if we succeeded on this trajectory, the recent, just yesterday, the Statistical Service released, not this week, the Statistical Service released its understanding of the progress. It says that is a bit more helpful in terms of growth. If we can sustain the growth at the rate at which we have projected and we exceeded, we are in a better position to improve, one, the revenue issue, and two, offer more employment for people, which then increases revenue mobilization. Secondly, we have tried to link up our SDG programs to the national budgeting framework. What this means is that much of the funding for SDG programs are currently aligned to national budget processes. And therefore, once we allocate funding for national budget process and we have resources for them, SDGs are to a large extent guaranteed to be implemented. That approach helps us to be able to track implementation and take remedial action where necessary. As I've alluded to previously, there's clear problems with the PFM systems in terms of budgeting, procurement, reporting, auditing, and all of that. Based on all that understanding, we formulated and are currently implementing a new PFM strategy, that is between 2022 and 2026. Just about yesterday, yes, there was a meeting with the World Bank on a project appraisal to support this strategy. We are trying to access approximately $150 million from the World Bank to be able to support the implementation of planned PFM interventions, which will seek to strengthen the PFM systems in Ghana and integrate them in a manner that allows them to support the implementation of national development programs. Key among the objectives of this strategy is to improve and sustain external and domestic resource mobilization. As indicated previously, our revenue mobilization rate is around 14% this year. If we can shoot it to around 18-20% as our contemporaries have, we would rake in more resources to enable us to address clearly the fiscal gap that is to do with financing the SDGs. Again, if we successfully strengthen the PFM system, we would enhance commitment control and therefore reduce expenditure arrears. Part of the...
Can I ask you to wrap up in 1 minute?
Sure, I should. I should be wrapping up now. We are strengthening cash management, treasury management, debt management. We are trying to enforce accounting and reporting, integrating our automated systems in order to respond and report appropriately. And then at the country and national level, we are managing partnerships between government, private sector, academia, philanthropy, and all other stakeholders to be able to sustain the momentum so far gathered. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Osei. Very appreciative to hear the experience in Ghana from the Ministry of Finance perspective. Now we'll turn to Dr. Charles Nyaba, who's the Executive Director of the Peasant Farmers Association of Ghana. We're running slightly behind schedule, so I hope Dr. Nyaba can be concise in his points to talk about how in the agriculture sector, which is another one that experiences some significant underspend, what they're finding in Ghana and how the perspective of civil society is in dealing with that. And just a brief reminder that if you have any questions for the Q&A, you can put them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to them during the discussion. Dr. Nyaba, over to you.
Thank you, and good evening. My name is Charles Dr. Nyaba. I work with the Peasant Farmers Association of Ghana. Yeah, so if you look at the constituents that I deal with, it's so complex. It's complex because this is a constituent that supply about 80% of the food need of the country. And at the same time, if you look at the poverty index, they rank the lowest in terms of food security. So we have developed so much interest in budget credibility issues because we think that there are a lot of constraints that are actually making these people not able to produce the food need for their own consumption and for the country. Now, if you look at Ghana's performance in terms of food security between 1990s to 2014, we were doing extremely well. But between 2019 to 2021, our performance in terms of zero hunger of the way we handle our budgets when it comes to agriculture sector, budget allocation, budget release, expenditure, and the quality of expenditure itself. So we develop so much interest in budget credibility issues. So we think that if you want to actually address issues of food security, we need to begin thinking about how much budget is allocated to the agriculture sector. So far, we have less than 1% budget expenditure to the agriculture sector. The expenditure itself is not the only problem. We are looking at how much is actually spent and the quality of expenditure. If you take the sector of interest, that government is investing so much money in Ghana, is a program we call Planting for Food and Jobs. Under the Planting for Food and Jobs, we have areas like extension services, we have support to fertilizer subsidies, we have support to seed, we have support to e-agriculture. But if you look at amount of commitment that government is made in these areas, and then you go to the field and talk to the farmers, you realize that the disparities are very wide. So as an association that represents the voices of over 1 million smallholder farmers, we saw the need to develop interest in these areas to be able to understand how government allocates budget and how this expenditure is made next. So if you look at the bar charts that are presented here, this shows budget expenditure trends for the period 2018 to 2021. So if you take 2021, for instance, the allocation to the agriculture sector and then the actual expenditure, there's a variation of about 27%. If you take a 2019, about 18%, and then if you take that of if you take that of 2021, the same thing. So if you have a sector that the constituents are expecting certain services to be provided, and those services are important to their contribution to the gross domestic product, and we are not able to do that, and at the same time, the amount that is allocated, we are not able to spend that, is problematic. So we think that we need to actually develop so much interest in engaging government to ensure that we improve on our allocation and at the same time improve on the expenditure. So what do? We try to engage Ministry of Food and Agriculture to provide them with information about the expenditure and the performance that is happening on the field. If you look at yesterday, for instance, we had a meeting with the Minister of Food and Agriculture, and we tried to provide him with information about how the fertilizer that is being subsidized is getting to the farmers or is not getting to them. We try to provide them with this information to see how we'll be able to improve. The things that we have come to realize is that even understanding of civil society in terms of government fiscal policies and its impacts on service delivery is very low. So we think that we need the technical understanding and analysis of budget credibility to be able to engage government on these issues. Beyond that, we realize that civil society have no interest in terms of budget credibility issues. So that is giving government leeway to always come out to say that, okay, we've done A, B, C, D to our agriculture sector, when in reality, you go to the grounds and you realize that the services do not reach the farmers. So we try to engage government on the budget cycle. When government is preparing its budget, we try to make input to identify the gaps that we need to actually put in money. Now, after the budget is allocated, we try to also go to the field to see the services that those budgets are supposed to be provided, to see how farmers are benefiting, and then we get the reports and give feedback to government. And that's what we are doing. So in going forward, we are very happy to be working with the IBP, and we are happy that Unicef is providing this platform. What we need to do is to build our capacity on budget credibility issues and bring more civil society organizations on board so that together we'll be able to mobilize more voices and more pressure on government to be able to commit more resources to what they say they're going to do, and also to monitor quality of expenditure of this budget allocation. Because one of the major constraints that we are facing as farmers is that on many occasions, we hear that this is how much government has allocated for subsidies to farmers. It could be in the area of fertilizer, area of seeds, area of mechanization. But you get to the field, you ask farmers where these inputs are being provided, and you realize that there is a gap between what government is reporting and what is actually getting to farmers. So we are thinking that it should get to a point, and we have started that, we are able to actually provide government with real-time data on budget credibility issues so that they understand that what they are actually intend or what they are doing, the farmers are aware or civil society are aware, and that we continue to monitor them and provide them with feedback and put pressure to ensure that the right things are done. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nyaba. That's a really interesting story about, I really appreciated the description of real-time data as a way to help improve the accountability. I thought that was a really helpful way to think about the feedback you're able to give to the ministry. So now we have time for a discussion. I can invite all the speakers to put their cameras back on for a discussion. We had a couple questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to put them out there, and I hope we can get maybe 2 rounds quickly, but I'm not sure. It depends how if all my panelists can answer in 2 minutes or less when they answer. But one of the questions that came in the chat was about corruption and the risks of corruption that are facing a lot of sectoral spending, and that, you know, despite transparency improving, how do we do that? And I thought that was a nice question to pair with the question about role of civil society and what civil society can do to help ensure budget execution is on track. So I hopefully will get Dr. Nyaba and Sally to respond to that very briefly. And then also out there to say, what are some of the tools that you know, this is a question Vivek had from International Budget Partnership. What kind of tools are out there to help ensure that transparency works? So I'm going to go in the order I have you on my screen from right to left, if that's all right. So I'm going to start with Sally, and then go back to Natalia and Dr. Osei, and then Moritz after that, and then Dr. Nyaba at the end. So Sally, please, over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. And that's a fantastic question, and it's a tough one because I think for many of us who work on budgets, you know, you're talking about these big numbers, right? These big numbers, where do they go? Are they being spent? And I think Dr. Charles's presentation really puts that in context of those numbers for people have a lot of meaning, but getting it to the level where you can understand, is it actually getting, is that service being provided? Is that subsidy getting out? really requires almost, you have to look way beyond the numbers. You have to look and you have to go talk to people. So I'll say, I mean, this links to the question that Vivek asked as well, which was one tool that I know a lot of IBP partners use to great effect, and Dr. Charles may speak more about what they're doing in Ghana on this, is social audits. And social audits have been for civil society organizations that are looking at specific programs. Training a whole bunch of enumerators to go out with a set of very clear questions about, are you accessing this service? What is your challenges that you face to do this? And then taking a look at who does and who doesn't get access to a service really does start to close the gap between, okay, we promised to get these services out, but actually we may be missing people, or actually money that we said was spent on the service may have gotten diverted to go elsewhere. Can we talk about this, right? And so I'll give an example that we didn't cover during the panel today, but IBP is actually—
Briefly, please.
Really briefly, we've done some work in Indonesia looking at a fuel subsidy program. And it's not necessarily a corruption issue, but it is a diversion issue, right? Where fuel subsidies are actually a huge portion of the kind of operational expenditures for smallholder fisher folk. And there's a fuel subsidy program that's supposed to support their livelihoods, but it really is about a fourth of the fuel that is supposed to be subsidized, that is kind of allocated to be subsidized, only a fourth of that is actually getting to fisher folk. And so there's a Fisher Folk Association in Indonesia that went out and did an audit, found that 82% of fisher folk did not get access to subsidized fuel. That's a huge number, and really started a very good conversation with government saying, can we fix this? And they've come a long way. They've discovered some bureaucratic red tape that they're working on. I mentioned that earlier. They're discussing how can they simplify procedures. They're discussing, are there alternatives to this program? So yeah, there's really interesting tools that civil society have to really start digging into where does this money go. So thanks.
Great, thank you. Dr. Ose, can we turn to you from the perspective of a Ministry of Finance, because it strikes me that when civil society is engaging on those kind of questions, they might be talking to the line ministry. And how do you think that works back to the finance ministry and to deal with some of the rigidities you talked about in budget execution during your intervention? So Dr. Ose, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. I noted with interest what Charles was talking about in terms of engaging Ministry of Food and Agriculture. I think it's fair, because then they are the actual people who get the resources, and therefore they're the first point of contact to be able to know whether the money is going or not. But this is Ghana. It's got a very vibrant media space. One, there's a very good framework within which civil society organizations can seek information from the public system in a way that the law allows you to. There's a free access to information, right to information law that is empowering people to ask the information. More importantly, as the Ministry of Finance, what we've done is to set up systems that allow us to track the movement of resources from where we sit. So on our IFMIS system, we're able to know at a go what estimates, what delivery we have done. And instantly you can know the deviations in between, and then you can find explanations as to how that has not been accessed or why they've been over-accessed. Where there are exemptions, you make the exemptions clear. So we are employing both technology to be able to do that in terms of automated systems. And then we are using the framework of civil engagement and asking that as many as interested. Just about recently, IPB came requesting information on budget execution for SDGs. And we had to respond clearly because it was empowered by the law. Previously, we would have just probably ignored the request and moved on. But now the law requires that we respond to that. It's in these types of engagements that we seek and believe that we can strengthen the PFM system to be able to deliver and help to account for the resources that are available.
Thank you. That's really interesting to highlight the point of the freedom of information laws and the role perhaps media and others play in getting information out. That's really helpful. Before I go to Dr. Nyaba again on Ghana, I actually want to hear from Mr. Moritz Piatti from the World Bank, if he has a chance, because I think it would be interesting to hear, on this question of tools, if there are specific tools in the health sector that he might recommend that help some of the budget accountability and credibility issues.
Thanks so much. I would actually like to briefly discuss the role of the Financial Management Information Systems, or IFMIS, as they are often called. they govern spending, right? They control all of the spending, or should control most of the spending that is happening. All of the spending at the spending unit level will be subject to the controls in that system that is managed by the Ministry of Finance generally. Right? But what we see looking across countries is that not all high-value transactions are necessarily channeled through the IFMIs. Right? What we see is that sometimes small-value transactions, right, the transactions at point of service delivery, go through the IFMIs internal controls. But then high-value transactions such as debt payments, wages and salaries, subsidies often don't. And I would actually like to also ask my colleagues from the Ministry of Finance in Ghana here on the panel to point to what the situation is there, because last time we had a conversation around that in Ghana. We found that picture, right? And as soon as those high-value transactions are not controlled by the IFMIs, but they are executed on a manual basis, then there is room for flexibility for the high-value transactions. But you are very tight around controlling the low-value transactions, but that is not where the risk is. Right? So from an accountability and transparency perspective, I would like to, one thing that we would like to recommend is just being transparent about what it is that the IFMIs is actually controlling, right? And what it is where expenditures are happening on a manual basis, and just report that, because that can say a wealth of things. Right? So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So I need to give Dr. Nyaba a quick chance before I come back to you, Dr. Osei. So Dr. Nyaba, question about, I think there's a question about how you, not only what tools to use for accountability, but how do you generate the political pressure to ensure that it works, that when you approach the government, they're responsive to your concerns in civil society. Over to you, Dr. Nyaba.
Yeah, so we have an interesting approach. We use approach where we try to provide information from the service received and the service actually reported by government as being provided. If we take a fertilizer subsidy, for instance, we have an occasion where government claimed that they provided certain tons of fertilizer to farmers. Then we also go to the communities to find out from the farmers how many people are actually receiving fertilizer, or how many trucks are getting to those communities. And there are instances where last year we have to put pressure to government that, look, these quantities you claim that we are providing to governments are not getting to the farmers. Either is being smuggled elsewhere, or either there is over-reporting against what has actually been received. So we have to put pressure, and then government was compelled to give some specific allocation to our groups so that we will do the actual distribution. So we try to follow that, and this year what we are doing is to take the data and try to monitor and follow where the fertilizer is going. So that by the end of the day, we'll take our own data and we are able to compare that to what government report that they've actually provided. So that if you compare the two, we are able to provide a picture. Now, we do this by carrying the media along. So at every point in time, government is being mindful. Because let me just cite a very short example of what we did. From the beginning of the season, I think the Minister of
Very short example, please.
Yeah. We were not too comfortable with the information we put there, but we keep putting pressure. Then he keeps saying that we shouldn't do, so we continue. Then he realized that the pressure was becoming too much. So yesterday he had to invite us. We sat with him. He said, we've heard your concerns, but equally having the same constraints. So let's work together and see how best both of us will put pressure on Ministry of Finance to ensure that what you are requesting for is actually delivered to the farmer. So we are preparing. We will soon be meeting Mr. Osei to discuss with him the allocation that is coming to us for this season.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful to hear about the, I like the description of alternative sources of data as a sort of accountability check. So Dr. Osei, can I give you 30 seconds, literally 30 seconds, to respond to the question about high value transactions? if you can unmute and talk about that.
Can you come again? It was breaking, please.
Just the question from Moritz Piatti about how, the difference between rigidities of controlling low value transactions versus high value transactions, and how the ministries of finance can work to make sure even the big transactions are controlled well and accountable for their spending.
Okay, quick one. So for most of high value transactions that the government of Ghana undertakes, there's a value for money assessment for them before even we go out there. And then they are publicized so that for every project we run in Ghana, there's a public information about the source of funding. All of that is given. And there are usually public information on that. So civil society organizations, local community people are empowered with that information to be able to seek accountability for whatever is supposed to be doing, we're supposed to be doing. It turns out that it's not the most good instances that people exercise that information to the best of our abilities. And that's why we will still count on our civil society organizations to be able to lead the charge, having provided a framework of engagement. And Charles will attest, many of the Ghanaians on this call will attest. Our doors are very open, and we are very open to issues that confront our nation, and therefore we are in a good position to respond to all the questions or concerns that will come across to us. But a quick one on Charles's point about fertilizer. It's been something that has been pressing on us, and he's right about the experiment about giving them tons to be able to move on. But the bigger solution we are experimenting is to, he will be aware that we are doing a project in Northern Ghana to register all farmers using GPS. The technology we are trying to get would allow us to sit here or sit anywhere and track the delivery from the warehouse to the farmhouse, from farm gate. In that way, whatever returns we get from the fertilizer distribution network will be verified at both ends. And so the issues of smuggle and all of that will be either minimized or completely done with. So it's the use of technology and data that's going to address that persistent problem of fertilizer distribution and agriculture inputs.
Thank you, Dr. Osei. That's really appreciated to hear about how you want to use technology. I think that's a theme that's come up a few times in the discussion today about information and technology and how that can feed into accountability. Just to say very briefly that was also a theme in the Financing for Sustainable Development report, throughout the report, around how different data and technology can really help improve financing across the agenda, including for things around debt sustainability, private sector investment, domestic resource mobilization, and spending. So I think that's really appreciated. So now I'm going to turn again to Natalia Windarossi from Unicef to close us out and to give us our final thoughts. Thank you to all the speakers for your participation from late at night in some places where you are. And we really appreciate your contributions. And we look forward to continuing this dialogue. Thank you. Natalia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. This is the kinds of discussions that we need to have more often, even during lunchtime or late at night. Really, I really enjoyed the different perspectives, and really a huge heartfelt thank you to all the members of the panel and all of you that have joined in the discussion online for a very rich discussion. I think we were very privileged to have such a diverse range of speakers who highlighted the importance of the issue from the different perspectives. Now, IBPs and the bank's new research and the practical experience from government and from the PF lag in Ghana, showing really how much budget credibility challenges do have, concrete impacts in terms of how we're delivering essential services to families, to children, to communities, and ultimately a big hurdle in really achieving our development goals. I was really struck by the findings on the challenges that we have are greater, particularly in low-income countries, and particularly in those services that are most critical for vulnerable populations. but also hopeful that we were able to identify some critical and concrete proposals and approaches, share what have worked, promising practices as we call, and how to best identify those budget credibility challenges and how to move forward to addressing them effectively as representatives of governments, as civil society, as UN technical partners, as NGOs, as donors. I really appreciated the active discussion, the exchange, which I think further demonstrated the great interest and ideas. And I hope that this is something that we can continue. I think my takeaway or my hope is that this is only the beginning. In a context where governments are facing ongoing shocks, fiscal challenges, where we see the gaps to achieve the SDGs in terms of financing continue to expand, it is more important than ever that the available resources are protected, are well planned, are well spent, and I think we know, and we've learned during this afternoon, that there's a lot that we can do collectively to help to improve this in relation to better monitoring and reporting, greater transparency, support to strengthen national public finance systems, and of course how we can leverage the expertise, the voice, the agency of different stakeholders, government, civil society, technical partners, and donors. From our side, from Unicef, we will continue to work in partnership with IBP in this important space, including in collaboration with governments and CSOs in several countries, and really looking forward to sharing more practical insights on this topic as the work continues. But also collectively, the importance to really continue to elevate and highlight these issues in our global fora, for example, the Financing for Development agenda, the different clusters that many of us participate, because it's important that this continues to be highlighted. We talk a lot about broader processes, and we need to go into the nitty-gritty that will make a difference in our next, when we try to meet on Agenda 2030. I understand that we will be sharing the different PowerPoint presentations, and of course the recording of this discussion will be available to everybody. But in the meantime, please do keep connected. Check out some of our existing research and resources on the IBP website. Follow us on Twitter, and please do continue to share the great example and practices on this very important topic. I look forward to continuing this conversation with all of you very soon. Many thanks.